Speak on Part 4 of the Infrastructure Bill. While Labor will be supporting the Infrastructure Bill, we will not be supporting Part 4 of this legislation. And in fact, I would like to point out the anomaly of even having this Part 4 in this piece of legislation, because what Part 4 does is it repeals a piece of legislation relating to affordable housing. And the question needs to be answered, Mr Chair, why was this part of the legislation hidden away in the Infrastructure Bill? Mr Chair, there are a number of people out there who probably would have submitted on this particular part of the legislation had they known to look in the Infrastructure Bill for the repeal of a piece of law on affordable housing. And what has become very clear is that the government didn't want to make it obvious that once again they were backing down on an affordable housing issue, so they hid it away in the Infrastructure Bill in Part 4. Mr Chair, there are a couple of SOPs in my name on this part which I will speak to soon, but I want to firstly address the issue of restrictive covenants, because when the Affordable Housing Territorial Authorities enabling legislation was passed under the last Labor government, one part of that was to remove restrictive covenants where they were being used in order to stop social housing or affordable housing. And when we went through that process, the issue was raised with us that if you say that you cannot have a restrictive covenant which stops affordable or social housing as its primary purpose, then all someone would have to do is to say, well, it's actually for another reason, and the secondary purpose is that it stops social and affordable housing. And it was a ginormous loophole that the Select Committee back then decided to close, and we did do that. And we did that by saying that it was unlawful to have a restrictive covenant which had any purpose as prohibiting social or affordable housing. Now, for reasons that I completely do not understand, this minister has decided that he's going to go back to saying it has to be the principal purpose. And, Mr Chair, we asked for some advice from officials at the Select Committee, which we received, on the repeal of this piece of legislation and why the decisions were made. And what they said was that independent legal advice indicates that there is a risk that the phrase "one of its purposes" is too wide. And is likely to catch covenants that are entered into for legitimate purposes, such as covenants to preserve rural character, open space, sunlight or view. Opponents could argue that an undeclared purpose of a covenant is to exclude social housing, even though the wording of the covenant was quite different and apparently reasonable. Well, the point was, Mr Chair, that it was always that people who believed that a restrictive covenant was being used to stop social housing or affordable housing would still have to prove it. They'd still have to prove it. It was still a very, very high hurdle for them to have to clear. But by the government changing it back to say a covenant over land is void if a principal purpose of it is to stop the provision of social housing on the land, just opens that loophole right up again. And when we heard original submissions on this bill, we heard from the Human Rights Commission, who told us of a case in Nelson where a developer had said, well, it's for amenity value that it has to look like this, when the reality was that they didn't want disabled access on those houses, and it stopped people from the disability sector being able to put in community housing in that area. So he said, well, the principal purpose is amenity values. The reality was it was to stop housing with disabled access going in. And now this government says that's okay and that can happen. And that is completely unreasonable and completely ridiculous, particularly given that we went through a full Select Committee process on this piece of legislation in the last government. And under this current Parliament, we went through a very quick Select Committee process on the Infrastructure Bill, where naturally most of the submissions were on the Infrastructure Bill, not on the repeal of affordable housing or the issue of restrictive covenants. Which brings me to my next point, Mr Chair, which is that the government has also decided to take out affordable housing from the legislation. So while they're saying, well, we still think that there should be some kind of limit on restrictive covenants against social housing, we think it's okay that there be restrictive covenants against affordable housing. So I'm interested to hear from the Minister and the Chair why he thinks that restrictive covenants against affordable housing are okay. And I certainly hope that he will take a call on that matter. So I have an SOP in my name, Mr Chair, which does restore this particular clause back to the way it was under the previous government, where it went through a full Select Committee process, where the issue of restrictive covenants was first and foremost, Mr Chair,
Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Chair, was first and foremost in the submitters' minds, where we asked for extra advice on that, where it wasn't buried in a piece of legislation where people didn't know that it was there. Because it seems to me that this has been an ad hoc kind of decision by a government, and I wonder who's got in their ear and said now it's actually going to be really hard for us to be able to block out social housing and affordable housing, so it'd be nice if you got rid of that. Because, as was pointed out to us by the submitters that did come along, the submitters we contacted who submitted last time, who came along, they were very, very, very concerned at the opening up of this particular clause in the law. And the Minister of Housing has made a big deal about this. I mean, he's got up and said, I'm so great because I'm keeping the clauses on restrictive covenants. Well, actually, Minister, you're not. You're opening them wide up to abuse, wide open to abuse, as was reiterated by a number of submitters at Select Committee. Mr Chair, I now want to move on to my second SOP, which is to remove Part 4 from this piece of legislation entirely. And the reason I do that is because I am happy to admit that we probably could have done better with the Affordable Housing Territorial Authorities enabling legislation. If the government was serious, we would be happy to support it back to a select committee to go through a process where we could address any of the issues that they had with it. Now, we haven't heard why the government wants to get rid of it. This is kind of like the shared equity affordable housing scheme, which the government told Housing New Zealand to stop promoting after the election. So a 2-year pilot on an affordable housing program, 2-year pilot, 20 out of the 24 months, Mr Chair, that pilot was running under a national government that didn't tell anyone it existed. What a waste of money. What an absolute waste of money. If you were never going to continue with it, just get rid of it. Why go through the pretence and the expense of running a program that no one knows about? Because I suspect that affordable housing programs are much more effective when people know they exist. Now, that might be a stretch, but I'm pretty sure that if someone knows it exists, it's going to get a lot more uptake than if no one knows it exists. And this is the same kind of situation that we have here with this particular piece of legislation. Well, the National Party decided they never liked it from the start because they're not committed to affordable housing. They're not committed to addressing issues around affordable housing. So they decided from the start that they didn't like it. They have no interest in trying to improve it because they just would like to be able to get rid of it altogether, because this is not a government that takes affordable housing seriously. I mean, they think that the invisible hand of the free market will deliver homes to everyone, and if we give tax cuts to the richest people, eventually it will trickle down. It will trickle down to those at the bottom, and with their $3 a week tax cut, they'll be able to purchase a house. Because of course the number one policy for affordable housing for the National Party at the last election was tax cuts. Well, I don't know how someone on the minimum wage is going to be able, Mr Chair, to get into affordable housing on a $3 a week tax cut. And I want to read you something from the same paper that we received at Select Committee on Part 4 of this legislation around government policy to address housing affordability, because of course we had a number of submitters who came along very critical, again, of the fact that this piece of legislation, the repeal of this piece of legislation, was buried in the infrastructure bill. The fact was that since the legislation had been passed, in fact, affordable housing pressures had gotten worse, not better. And so there probably would have been more submitters who would like to have come along and had their say on affordable housing at that time. But of course they didn't know about it, because when you look for an affordable housing bill, you probably don't think to look in the infrastructure bill that deals with a code for utility operators and access to transport corridors to deal with affordable housing. And the paper that we received at Select Committee, Mr Chair, said that they got rid of this because the government was doing so much on affordable housing. They had the Gateway Housing Initiative. Details of the initiative are expected to be announced in October 2009. Well, it's now July 2010, and this mythical Gateway program has yet to appear. It got no funding in this year's budget, so that's a cross. And then this is fantastic. One of the government's affordable housing initiatives is the sale of state houses. That's right. The sale of state houses. How is a program that sells houses at market prices to people who can't afford it an affordable housing initiative? So, and then the other one, of course, was the Welcome Home Loan Scheme, which was a Labor Party scheme. So the only tick we get in here for the affordable housing initiatives of this government is the Labor Party's Welcome Home Loan Scheme. We have a Gateway Housing Initiative, which doesn't exist. Sale of state houses to tenants, which is not an affordable housing initiative, as we've seen, because the uptake has been about 20 people, despite the Minister saying that he thought it would be hundreds rather than thousands. Well, it's turned out to be tens rather than hundreds or thousands. But the hopes and the dreams of a large number of people were raised when the Minister knew that they would never be able to get into those homes because it's not an affordable housing initiative. And here we are in Part 4.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable
Mr. Chairman.
Bill English.